what is the general cost for the execution of environmental impact assessments within the African continent. We have currency differentiation factors. We have a lot of acceptability issues within the continent of Africa that has to do with EIA implementation, that's environmental impact assessments, or if you like, environmental and social impact assessments. I will later on talk about the differences in the nomenclature, but generally, for the sake of this short talk, I will call it EIA. So basically, the ongoing study is for Nigeria and South Africa. We are trying to see what the cost of EIA is in these two countries. Don't forget, Nigeria and South Africa, from relevant study, has been a leading developing country in terms of the introduction of environmental impact assessment for development projects. It could be government-driven projects or World Bank-sponsored projects. It could also be individually sponsored project, and also taking a look at the regulatory framework for the implementation of EIA. I think from the study executed so far, Nigeria and South Africa stand out, but we are going to be deepening our study for the other African countries. The wide adoption of EIA internationally is explicitly based on the assumption that the benefits of EIA outweighs the cost. But again, what do we mean by cost? What do we mean by cost? For the sake of this presentation, or this short talk rather, we will be looking at the financial cost for executing environmental impact assessments. Most people who have executed for their project, according to a study executed in South Africa, which I will drop the reference in the chat box later on, most of these companies have said that EIA has additional cost that is not just monetary. We have also time delays. In the average, for a successful completion of environmental impact assessment, you will have to plan for a year. That is from the scoping stage all the way through the issuance of the approval or the certificate or the environmental impact statement, which is the final deliverable and also a policy instrument that shows that the project have undergone environmental impact assessment and have approval for the study. So that is the frame, the time frame, the time cost is also an issue of concern. So when we are comparing the local within Nigeria, or let's say within South Africa or within any African country, when we are comparing the cost for execution of EIA to the international EIA systems, you would see generally, based on studies we have undertaken and based on my personal experience for the past 15 years on executing impact assessments for different sectors of economies, I have seen that the international EIA systems is particularly higher in cost, in monetary cost estimations than the local EIA systems within individual country. I will try to share with you a typical EIA system so that we can assign some costs to each of the components of the EIA. But generally, we have percentage of total project cost. We are trying to see if we can come up with an estimation looking at the project cost, because most projects must have undergone feasibility studies report before diving into any kind of project. Proponents will have a feasibility studies report to see if this project is viable and if the economic aspects or the economic expectations of this project is achievable in terms of profit. And when we look at the sustainability as a whole, which is fusing together the economic benefits, the social benefits of the project, and other benefits that could be accrued to it. When we fuse that together, we could say, okay, this project is viable or not. So during the planning stages, we should be able to estimate that, okay, the cost of executing EIA for this project is going to be so amount of so percentage, a particular percentage of the total cost of executing the project itself. So most EIA in Africa is conducted in a smaller scale, including the expert studies that needs to be undertaken during the baseline information gathering and the systematic procedure that needs to be followed during the execution of the EIA. This may also explain the reason why the cost is particularly low compared to international EIA systems. So I will quickly share with you this particular, okay, this is a typical environmental impact assessment flow chart. As you can see, I picked up the one used in Nigeria precisely, and the estimations is in Naira for this particular study. This particular flow chart, I mean, it is estimated in Naira. So depending on the currency variations, I will drop what it means in the chat box for you. So you have the submission of project proposal or the feasibility study and the terms of reference for the environmental impact assessment study by the proponent to the Federal Ministry of Environment. So you can see the meager amount that has been dropped there as the registration fee. In this process, what we do at Richflood is to grab the feasibility study report and pick up some components of the study and do an application to the Federal Ministry of Environment that this project seeks to apply for EIA in Nigeria, for instance, and we are seeking the cooperation of the Federal Ministry of Environment as the regulatory agency for the execution of EIA. So in your country or in the country where you plan to execute a project, you would have to, or your consultants, which could be Richflood, will have to reach out to the local authorities in that country or in that state and find out the legal entity that's ought to carry out the EIA study together with the consultant. It is done in a certain way that both the consultant and the regulatory agency have to work together to execute the project. So the regulatory agency, of course, plays the oversight function over the consultant's work and also over the proponents' work, both during the planning, operation, and even the decommissioning stages of the project. So let me, I've had a lot of questions asking when you should carry out an environmental impact assessment, mostly from African countries. When you should carry out the environmental impact assessment is during the planning stage of your project. At the time that you have done your feasibility studies and you think this has economic benefits, but you want to incorporate the environmental sustainability aspect into your project, then there is a due diligence that needs to be done, which is environmentally inclined, and also a social due diligence that is being done, which we could call the social impact assessment of your project. That's why we have most nomenclature will say ESIA and not EIA. That's the social component is being added to it. So the answer to the question is that, yes, you start the environmental impact assessment study during the planning stage of the project, irrespective of whether the project is an internationally funded project or it's a local project within a local government, within a state, or funded by the government or by a local bank, as the same principle and is the same procedure that applies in terms of the timing. This is done before project commencement. That's at the project planning stages. Then we have the screening stage, which is the initial environmental evaluation, which includes site verification. At this point in time, the regulatory agency, in this case, the Federal Ministry of Environment, will go together with Richflood, being the consultant for the project, to the site. And this has financial implications. I forgot to mention the financial implications are in two arms. You have the consultancy fees, and you also have the regulatory fees to pay. I hope this is clear, because we've been having questions from our clients to differentiate, or they do not understand, or what does this mean? So I will try to address all of the questions in this presentation or in this short talk. So we have the consultancy fees that you pay to Richflood, and then we have the statutory fees. Let's call it the statutory fees. These are fees you pay to the regulators, to the administrators, which includes the Federal Ministry of Environment, sometimes the local state Ministry of Environment, and relevant agencies that could be identified during the stakeholders mapping activities. We usually will do the mapping and check which stakeholders are going to be involved, and which stakeholder is an administrator of the EIA, which stakeholder is an enforcement agency for the EIA, and which stakeholders have the laws, like the land use laws, which stakeholders are involved in this aspect as well. And we try to carry them along. We try to involve them at the early stage of the project, and most especially during the scoping exercise. We try to involve stakeholders that have been identified as really important, or that have regulatory power over the project. So we have to look at the scope of work that has been drafted by Richflood, and usually there will be a presentation of the scope and an approval of this scope of work. So now, talking about cost, during the screening exercise, that is the site verification exercise, you have to make payments to the regulatory agency, which is the environmental agency that is administering the EIA together with the consultant. Each stage, as indicated on this chart, has financial implications attached to them. So you could be spending around, let me say, 500,000 Naira, which is an equivalent of, okay, just a second, which is an equivalent of $800 at the screening stage for the stakeholders' participation. And then you could budget about $1,000 for the consultancy fees for the stage at the minimal. That's the local requirement for this, okay? Then the scoping stage, the development of the terms of reference, you could also budget $1,500 for the regulatory agency during the scoping exercise, because stakeholders will come in. That is deposited who is regulating the EIA. But then you have the logistics aspect and even the screening exercise for all of the logistics, the those who have to be accommodated, and requirements, as the case may be. All right. Then the next stage you see for the terms of reference, this is done desktop at this office, and consultant as to whether the has been accepted or whether there are adjustments to be done at that point. Of EIA by a registered consultant. So in different registration requirements for consultants, you have to find one in Africa. So when you contact Richflood and execution of the EIA, then we give you a cost. Usually, please, for clarity, process starts and finishes with your consultant Richflood. Middle, when you have submitted it to your back and forth, maybe due to technical general competency of whoever drafted it. You know, we do not want to be involved at the middle of be involved from the beginning. So usually Richflood to the environmental agency and reference approved with the participation of the parties, and also execution of the EIA. It means that activities. That means we have to different experts for both environmental and for instance, you may have the biodiversity specialist, economic specialist, who will take care of the social, and also you have the, you could have the archaeology, the air quality specialist, you could have the soil, the hydrogeologist, the geologist. These people have to be, have to be paid for. So this influences the cost. Okay. Just a second, let me see, something went up. Cost of an EIA execution, because the special different roles, different professional roles during the execution of EIA. This is actually the longest process. Data gathering during the wet season and the dry seasons. So this is a comprehensive study. And depending on the location of the project, you know, I was mentioning a specialist that we bring on board a typical EIA. You could have people who would study the cultural area, those who all right. So okay, sorry for the mix-up. Just a second, I need to show back the screen. All right, yeah. Okay, so we are still at the stage for EIA execution. So like I said, this takes more than a year. I mean, not more than a year. The whole process takes estimated 1 year and maybe more than. But for the EIA execution, it has to be 2 seasons. That is the wet season and the dry season data that we usually want to gather. And in most countries, it is like that. So this period, like I said, we have the specialists do different roles during the study and then produce different reports, different expert reports, including the acoustic specialist, that is for noise measurements, for daytime, for nighttime, and the simulations that goes with that study. So different specialists undertake different expert studies and then produce their reports, and then we establish that as the baseline environmental condition. Same way, socially as well, we have to go into the community and run some demographic studies and check the lifestyle of the people, archaeological studies, histories, and cultures, and whatever we can gather during the visits to most especially the communities, the host communities. We want to know, is their land taken? And if it wasn't taken, is it their farmlands? Or it's what kind of land ownership, occurs in those areas? Sometimes this could be very remote African communities, okay? So we go in there, and the studies are done by specialists that are skilled in engagement and have the experience and the skill for providing data that we need for the sake of documenting the baseline information for the project. Why is this done? Because we want to come back in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years' time, and do a form of monitoring to see what has changed from the baseline information to 2 years after the baseline data capturing what has really changed. So this is why that is done, and there are good reasons why it is done for 2 years. This is because we check the tidal variations, we check the soil variations, dry and wet season, and so many other factors, including hydrogeology, that have alterations due to seasonal variations. So that is why this is done for 2 seasons, because of hard questions in that regard. Okay, so what else? The cost for this stage is, now let's look at the regulatory cost, which we call the statutory cost. For every stage of data gathering, the regulatory agency ought to go with the consulting firm, that is Richflood, to this proposed project locations for data gathering. So once that is done, it's for quality assurance or quality control reasons that other stakeholders are invited to be a part of the data gathering processes. So this could cost between $3,000 to $4,000 of involving other stakeholders. And during the execution stage, that's for the environmental data gathering. For the social aspects of data gathering, there would be lots of events that will take place at that time. There would be engagement programs that will take place. That's meetings that will take place. Sometimes we go, not sometimes, most of the time, we go into the communities and have focus group discussions. We have discussions with different groups of the communities. We have peculiar groups that have to be discussed with, that discussions have to take place with. It could be the chiefs, it could be the youths, it could be the women group, it could be the working class, it could be the farmers. In that environment, we could also do some ranking of stakeholders and tag some stakeholders as impacted stakeholders, those whose farmland have been taken because of the project. We have special messages for them that we will discuss the impact. We capture their grievances. Sometimes there are grievances due to the project. This is being captured intensively. during the execution of the EIA. And again, a cost that may not reflect on this flow chart is for that of the stakeholders engagement, which starts all the way from the beginning of the start of the EIA to the end of the EIA. In fact, engagement process does not end because we tend to hand it over to the proponent to continue to engage with the communities if they have if they have a department that could take care of such engagements to make sure that there is a cordial relationship between the proponents, that's the project execution, project operation team. Sorry. And the project implementation team. So in the overall, you find out that the engagement never ends, the discussions never ends, and also committees are set up in order to ensure that this happens. So we have a training module that takes care of that. You can go to the website, learn.richflood.com to understand the engagement approach that some countries have adopted, and also the International Finance Corporation, that is the IFC guideline for engagements. So we move forward. I can't exhaust the discussion on execution of EIA. We have other trainings that could take into cognizance the full execution of EIA, the processes, the procedures, and the deliverables. Okay, so submission of draft EIA report. This will cost you, let's say, estimated $1,000 to pay into the government agency POS, and you could now look at the next, which is the review of the EIA draft report. You have a public review for 21 days display. You have a panel review, that is a group of experts that will come together to review the report, to check its to check the inputs. I mean, the inputs, yes, from different experts, specialists that have done different studies. These different studies will now be reviewed. Comments will be raised for either adjustments, looking at the scope of work, that's the terms of reference that has been approved, and also what was delivered. So this takes place at a panel review meeting, and you could estimate about $6,000 conservatively for the panel review meeting, because this is usually done in the project location, most like the nearest town to the project location, where the experts can gather, maybe in a hotel, and have these reviewed. And you could budget that. Then for the 21 days display exercise, this is done in newspapers. The newspapers adverts and the radio houses, depending on the best communication approach that is widely acceptable in that location. So it could be town criers, it could be newspaper, it could be any form of communication that can be adopted at the in the different stages, and however it goes, it could get accepted. Okay, So the cost for the public review, you could budget between $3,000 to $4,000, depending on the country and the rates per page for the newspapers or the frequency. I mean, the cost for the frequencies of the radio jingles that would be aired, you know, and whatever works there, but that budget will do just fine. Then moving forward, the provisional approval. When you get a provisional approval at the next stage, after the report has been reviewed and updated and submitted back to the ministry, then, or to the agency, environmental agency, then you have a provisional approval where the proponent is allowed to commence projects, preparatory. Proponent starts preparatory works on the project site and prepares the final EIA report. Okay, so we have the impact mitigation monitoring, which we also call the IMM. So the IMM basically is to check the compliance, because when an EIA is done, the fully executed EIA and the reports produced and the draft, the final EIA report is also produced, we have the mitigation measures that has been developed for the project. We have environmental management plans that has been developed for the project. We may even have biodiversity management plan. We may have air quality management plan. We may have resettlement action plan. We may have, there are different management plans that could be developed for the project. So the impact mitigation monitoring is to check the compliance level of the mitigation measures, whether the project is complying with the plans, and if they are not, where are the gaps, and how can these gaps be filled? That is during the impact mitigation monitoring. And the states and local people or governments are also involved in the process of the impact mitigation monitoring. So during this monitoring, we have corrective actions that we may suggest to the proponent or the project operators that, okay, these are corrective actions that needs to be taken and they are not properly taken. Or yes, the project is doing well in terms of implementing the management plans that have been developed for the project. So during the submission of the final EIA, that's what we call, it's not reflecting here, but I think it's not reflecting here, but there's what we call the final assessment charge. The final assessment charge also could budget between $2,000 to $3,000 for the final assessment charge for the project, because during the panel review exercise, the site is meant to be visited. That is during this review, during this disclosure period, the site is meant to be visited again by the regulatory agencies. So the cost of visiting, which may cost you around $1,000, would also be put into consideration. Okay. So please, this cost I am mentioning, I ought to do a disclaimer at the beginning. It's not cast in stone. I'm just giving an overview or an idea or a hint of what you should expect if you are to execute an environmental impact assessment. And there is another cost, which is translation to different languages. The EIA report could be produced in French and needs to be translated to English, or needs to be produced in English and translated to French and other languages, depending on the users or the need to do so. Okay, so the certificate is being paid for also In some countries, you could pay up to $1,500 for the certificate, for the approval itself. So, and then the approval is obtained, and then the EIA process is completed. So this is this is a long process, but at Richflood, we have different departments that does different execution. We have the administrative department that handles the administrative processes. We have different technical units based on the expert studies that needs to be done. And also the admin unit, actually, after the technical work have been 100% delivered, the admin unit now takes up the role of processing the EIA approval from the point of submission of the report itself. Yes. Okay. So that is it. If you have questions, you can drop it in the comment box. I will do a more comprehensive cost estimation for an ESIA and shoot so that we can have a total cost. But I know in your head now you're running to and fro saying, okay, how much is it going to cost for the consultancy fee? We usually cannot fix a rate for the consultancy fee until we know where the project is located, what is the accessibility of the project, and what the security situation is for the project. I remember we have a project offshore, and for weeks, we couldn't sort out the accessibility for the project. So some projects you have to hire a helicopter to get there, and some projects you can go through a boat, and some you would need some security depending on how the community is or how the project location is. So you can send us an email, info@richflood.com, with your project information, specific location or specific project, and we can take a look at it and do an estimation. But I think by now, I hope it makes sense that you have an idea what to budget, most especially when it comes to statutory engagement of the agencies, environmental agencies in the state or in the country where this project is to be situated. I would also try to do an international EIA system review of cost, because most projects also will not take into consideration the international requirements. For instance, if the IFC performance standards are to be incorporated in the study, it may take a different dimension, and it would be more monetarily more expensive or more costly. I don't know what terminology to use. Okay, so let me know what you think in the comment box. Feel free to drop your questions. And I promise I will do a more comprehensive presentation for you to see an estimated total. I could even pick the sectorially, like we could pick a power sector, mining sector, agriculture sector, and then show you the different cost implication for undertaking environmental and social impact assessment. I hope this is useful. Take care, and thank you for being here and watching the video. See you some other time. Goodbye.